We're back. We're going to talk more about machine learning. And last time we talked about this like feed-forward neural network. And if you remember in the neural networks we were using the other day, we had like input, and then we get passed forward into the next layer, and we get passed forward into the next layer, and forward into the next layer, and so on and so forth. And that sort of neural network we called a feed-forward neural network. Today we're going to be doing a different neural network, which is called a transformer. And the reason that we care about it is not just our undying love of machine learning technology, but also is the primary components in AlphaFold. So in AlphaFold, we have this big MSA and template matching thing. That gets connected to a tiny neural network that gets the MSA and the templates ready. And then we have the bulk of the neural network right here and right here, which are using transformers to actually figure out what to do with the sequences to turn them into structures. And so the goal today is not to develop a super deep understanding of the mechanisms and exactly, the inner workings of a transformer. We're going to try to get a fuzzy understanding, an intuition for what's going on. And to do this, we're going to take sort of a meandering path. And that path starts with one of my favorite topics, which is word vectors. So let's say you really wanted to understand what a word means. It's actually a really, really hard problem to know what a word means, and it's something that's still debated in philosophy. But one of the top competing definitions for words, one of the top competing meanings for what words actually are, is that we could say a word is just how it is used. A word is only how it relates to other words. The only way we can find any meaning in a word is if we understand how that word can be used in specific contexts. And so, we have this sentence, the big dog jumped high. If we really understand what dog means, then we should be able to understand how it relates to all the other words and also how all the other words relate to it. And if we have that deep understanding, one thing we should be able to do is block it out. We would call this masking, and we should be able to predict what word would go in there. And dog fits fine, the big dog jumped high, that makes sense. Cat also fits. The big cat jumped high. So does frog, the big frog jumped high. There's a lot of words that fit, and there's also a bunch of words that don't fit. Pizza doesn't make any sense in that sentence. And you can imagine with relatively small changes to the context, we could change what words would fit in there. If instead it was, instead of the big blank jumped high, if it was the furry blank jump high, then suddenly, cat and dog still work, but frog would not make any sense. And so there's this really sort of interesting relationship to how words work in their context. And the whole point of word vectors is to actually encode that relationship. And so with our brains, my understanding of the neuroscience is that with words like cat and dog, the neurons that represent those words are actually grouped relatively close together inside your head. And neurons that represent more distant words, like pizza or jumped, those are further away than the words for cat and dog. Words that are similar to each other are grouped together. We're going to use vectors inside our computer to do the exact same thing. So here's a Cartesian plane, and we're going to try to figure out how to make vectors for each one of these words such that the and a maybe get grouped together over here, and words like big and small get grouped together over here. Cat, dog, frog get grouped over here. Maybe pizza's way over there. Jumped and sat could be over there, and high and low could be over there. So our whole goal is going to be to make this Euclidean space so that we can group words together, and how closely words are grouped together is going to be dependent on how similar they are. In other words, how many similar contexts we could put that word in. So here's sort of the first step. When we have our words, one way that we can try to understand the meaning is we can look up the words in a dictionary. We can look up what the definition of those words are. We are going to start this process by making a dictionary, but instead of definitions, we're going to have vectors. So when we are looking at a sentence like the big dog jumped high, we look up the in our dictionary and we get the vector. And we do that with big and dog and jumped and high. Now, a super important thing is the dictionary doesn't change even if the sentence does. So, are you a dog is a completely different sentence, but the dog vector ends up being the same. This is just a lookup in a dictionary. We grab the vector that corresponds to the word that we're looking at, and that is what we're going to be using. And for most of my drawings and what have you, I'll be drawing vectors in two-dimensional space. In reality, each one of these vectors is going to be like 500 dimensions or 1,000 dimensions. It's going to be a large dimensional space. And it turns out that things are just easier to learn in high dimensional spaces. So we have our sentence, we have our vectors, and initially all of our vectors are random. And our goal is going to be to train our vectors so that we get that sort of distance relationship that we would like, where like words are grouped with like words. So the way that we're going to do this is we're going to have a huge library of text. And this text is going to contain books and Wikipedia articles, the entire internet, everything. And we're going to just pull sentences out of this huge library of text. And what we're going to do is we are going to drop out words from this sentence. From this point, we're going to feed all of these other vectors into a neural network. We call the surrounding context the context. We're going to feed the context into a neural network, and the neural network is going to predict some place in our vector space where it thinks a word would work here. And this is really, really fuzzy, but just stay with me. We're going to try to work through this. So what we have so far is we have our context that gets fed into the neural network. The neural network then doesn't predict a word exactly, it predicts a place. And it says, I think this is the noun place with like animals or something. So what we're going to do then is we are going to have the word that actually fits there. This is what we call our positive sample or our positive example. And we're also going to have some words that don't fit in there. And we just randomly choose these. These are called our negative examples. So with our positive example, what we're going to end up doing, with our positive example up here, what we're going to end up doing is we are going to push it in the direction of whatever the thing we predicted was. So here we predicted this blue color. We're going to push dog more in the blue direction. At the same time, with our negative examples, we are going to push them away from this blue color. We push them away. So we push our positive example towards whatever the neural network predicts. We push our negative example away from whatever the neural network predicts. And if you do this a whole bunch of times, you start out with random vectors, but as you do this, the vectors start to gain more structure. And hopefully by the time you're done doing this training, what you have is a trained set of vectors with relationships so that similar words are grouped in the nearby vector space. And it turns out to be the case. If you were to look at all of these vectors, you would see the vector and the a vector would be grouped together, and the big vector and the small vector would be grouped together, and dog and cat and so on and so forth. And it turns out that this is super cool, not just because we are grouping words based off of how they're used, but also there are arithmetic relationships that represent sort of semantic relationships. And so here's an example of what I mean by that. So this is not Sam Leibman's original research, but this is his original visualization as far as I can tell. And what he's showing here is distance relationships and word vectors. So this is real data. If you take the word vector for the word king and the word vector for the word queen, it's the same distance as the word vector for man and woman. So there's this gender distance that remains constant inside word vector systems, which is really interesting. And we get the same thing with verb tenses. So walking has the same distance to walked as swimming has to swam. And so we have this like crazy, interesting relationship. And it's even true for like more proper noun type stuff. So Spain to Madrid is the same distance as Italy to Rome, which is the same distance as Germany to Berlin. And you can do arithmetic on this. So for example, if you were to take the vector for Spain and you were to, if you were to take the vector for Madrid and you were to subtract the Spain vector and then add the Italy vector, you would end up exactly at the place for Rome. So you can actually do this crazy arithmetic and you can say, oh, this word relates with addition and subtraction to this other word. We can sort of fuzzily describe where we want our vectors to be, and we can find the words that correspond to that position in the space. So this is like crazy stuff, and it turns out that this is true for biology also. So if instead of words we had amino acids, and we did this exact same thing where we assign vectors for all of our amino acids, and then we try to predict the surrounding context, or we have the surrounding context try to predict the central amino acid, the vectors for our amino acids group up. And what we'll find is amino acids with similar physiochemical properties end up, in these clusters, and we have stronger clusters here, we have, a cluster right here, we have stuff over here, and amino acids that, don't perform the same sorts of functions, that have very different physiochemical properties, do not group up. They are far away from each other. And this is just insanely cool. This is, in a way, this is better than the just using an amino acid. You can get alignment scores out of these. You can predict physiochemical properties out of these. But there's one big downside to all of these word-to-vec type methods. And the big downside is that they are just a dictionary. They don't care about the actual context. They care about this global definition of the word. So if I have 3 sentences, such as the bat hit the ball, the bat flew, and the big bat ate, in this case, every single one of these bat words would have the exact same vector. But we're actually using these words in different ways. And so, in the first one, we're talking about a baseball bat. In the second one, we are clearly talking about the mammal bat. And although the third one is also talking about the mammal, it has additional information. What type of bat is it? It's a big bat, and it's eating. And so we have this additional information about this bat that we don't have about this bat. And so although I would want this bat to be very similar to this bat, they're very similar, they are a little bit different. We have additional context which tells us more information about this bat than this bat. So this is the problem that transformers try to solve. And they do it with something called attention. And the overarching idea with attention is we'll start out with our normal word vectors. And so this is the same thing that we started with last time. These aren't random. These are trained word vectors. And what we're going to do is we're going to have every single word look at every single other word and try to gain insight based off of what that word is. So the is going to look a lot at bat. It's going to pay a lot of attention to bat because it's a noun and it's right next to it. And it's going to pay a little bit of attention to everything else. And it's going to say, I'm a the, but I am a the that is paying attention to the bat. I am a the that is corresponding to the bat. And so it's going to adjust its vector based off of that. And bat's going to do the same thing. It's going to go, there is a ball and hit in this sentence. I don't think that I'm the mammal bat. I think I am the baseball bat. And it's going to adjust its vector accordingly. And every single word does this. And then once we've done this, once we do it again, and we do it again, and we do it again, and every single time we do this, each one of our vectors is getting a little bit smarter. It's understanding what the word is in this sentence a little bit deeper. And the way that you sort of train this transformer model, this attention-based approach, is just like the word-to-vec training, or at least very similar. So with transformers, here's what we'll do. We'll start by taking a sentence out of our huge library of text, and we are going to randomly drop one out. Once again, we call this masking. So we're going to randomly mask bat. And then we're also going to randomly mutate a word. So we'll randomly mutate the to apple. So now our sentence is apple big furry blank flew and ate. And what's going to happen really quickly is Apple's going to look around and it's going to say, do you know what? I'm trying to pay attention to everything in the sentence, but nothing makes sense if I'm an apple. I must not be an apple. I must be something else. And so it will very quickly figure out that it is not supposed to be apple. It's supposed to be some sort of article. Similarly, with this blank here, you know, the big furry blank flew and ate. There's not many big furry things that fly and eat. So it's either a bat or a Pegasus, and it can probably figure out that it's going to be a bat. And so as it goes on, the network will learn through this attention mechanism, oh, this word actually was supposed to be this thing, and this blank was actually supposed to be this thing. And this is the training task for transformers. What we're saying is that if the transformer is to learn, then what it's actually doing is it's learning how to replace words in sentences, and it's learning how to correct sentences. And if you can really do that process super, super well, then you have a really deep understanding of sentences and words at large. So here's what we got so far. We have vectors can represent words, and this was the whole word to vec thing. And more than that, it is representing relationships to other words. Context changes words. This is something that everybody knows intuitively, and it is completely true, it turns out. Context changes words, and we needed a way to adjust our vectors based on the context. And finally, transformers are the solution to that. They encode context into words. They are more powerful than just using a single vector for words because they're able to look at sentences and actually figure out what that sentence means. So this is the whole technology that makes AlphaFold 2 work. AlphaFold 1 was incredible, but it didn't have transformers and it didn't work. AlphaFold 2 has transformers and it works incredibly. And this is the big block that we're going to be paying attention to right now. So what this block does is it tries to understand the evolutionary relationship of the sequences that is being fed into it. It tries to really understand the multi-sequence alignment that we give it. And so this is just like what we were doing a second ago, but instead of using sentences, we're using multi-sequence alignments. And so here's sort of what happens. Here's a multi-sequence alignment. We're going to apply two types of attention. And in reality, AlphaFold does some extra fancy attention on top of this. But these are the two big types of attention we're going to do. We're going to do row-wise attention. And what we mean by this, well, actually, before we even do that, here's the task. The task is we block out amino acids and we'll mutate amino acids and we ask AlphaFold to recover those amino acids. So anyways, to recover these amino acids, we do row-wise attention, which is for every single sequence in our multi-sequence alignment, we'll do that whole attention thing. Every amino acid is going to ask every other amino acid, hey, what are you? Do you think that you matter to me? And with a lot of language, it's the super short distance relationships that matter. You can imagine that this L and this G have a lot of influence over this R because they're really close by. But also, proteins fold. And so if there is enough distance, maybe this E and this S end up being near each other in space, in which case, if this transformer is to really understand what's going on in this sentence, it has to actually model the structure. So this is the whole idea. We're going to model structure by understanding these individual sequences, and we'll do this row-wise attention for every single sequence. So we do it with this sequence, and then we'll do it with this sequence, and we just keep on doing this. The other type of attention that the AlphaFold model is going to be doing, the evoformer is going to be doing, is this column-wise attention. Inside the column-wise attention, we do exactly what that sounds like. We pay attention in columns. So instead of having every word in a sentence pay attention to each other, every amino in a sequence, we're going to have every amino in a column of amino acids pay attention to each other. And what this is really saying is each one of these is saying a little something like, hey, I'm an E, and I think I'm doing this sort of function. What are you? And this one says, I'm also an E, and I'm doing a slightly different function. And I'm doing a slightly different function, and I think that I have something to tell you about what I'm doing. And they start communicating about the evolutionary relationships between sequences through this column attention. And if the column is all E's, maybe this isn't super interesting. Or if it's all G's, maybe it isn't super interesting. But if we have an example like this, where we have a column that is, it has a lot of different aminos inside it, then suddenly this becomes very interesting. If we were to try to predict what this amino acid is, and we didn't have transformers, the best we could do is we could look at all the columns in here, or all the amino acids in this column. We could say, most of them are A's, we're probably an A. But with transformers, this amino acid gets to talk to all these other amino acids, and it gets to say, hey, you right here, you are doing almost the exact same thing that I think I'm doing. I'm probably whatever amino acid you are. And so we get to have this super deep encoding of not just what the structure is meaning, but what the evolutionary relationships of every single one of these amino acids in this multi-sequence alignment is. And it turns out that this whole, this whole understanding, this whole transformer on evolutionary sequence is exactly what the secret sauce was to make protein folding work really well. And so this is the part of AlphaFold that works on understanding evolutionary relationships. And its loss function is that whole dropout task where we try to predict mutations, or we try to recover the original multi-sequence alignment. And this right here is the structural module, which then takes that information and tries to actually predict the structure. And its loss is, the loss over here is how good a structure predicts. It turns out that the evoformer is way more important than the structural module. Physics is too hard for the neural network to encode, but there's enough evolutionary signal to be able to learn a lot of really interesting evolutionary structure, which can then be applied to proteins. And to sort of demonstrate that, the evoformer has 48 of these huge transformer layers. And every single one of these layers is a unique network. Every single one of these layers is doing something slightly different than any of the other layers. On the other hand, the part that actually predicts the structure only has 8 layers, and each one of those layers is identical. What Google did in this experiment of AlphaFold 2 is they have shown that evolution is what matters, and if you want to understand protein folding very well, then you have to understand the evolutionary history of whatever sequence you are folding. And on top of that, actually, if you look at the loss function that AlphaFold 2 uses, it has a bunch of different parts. It has a part that, how can we predict confidence, and how can we do this MSA recovery task, and how can we predict the structure. The thing that they pay the most attention to, the thing that gets the most loss, is the multi-sequence alignment recovery step. It's 4 times more. They allocate 4 times more resources to this evoformer loss that does the multi-sequence alignment recovery than they do to the actual structural prediction task, which is hilarious. And that is pretty much all I wanted to tell you about transformers. And we didn't talk about a whole lot, but I feel like there's a lot of conceptually challenging stuff. And so I suppose the big takeaways from today is that AlphaFold is really cool. And what it's trying to do really is it's trying to understand multi-sequence alignments and the evolutionary history behind it. The way it does that is by really understanding every single amino acid inside that multi-sequence alignment and really trying to understand the function that that amino acid is doing. And I think that is it. Are there any questions about anything I covered? Yes.
So I'm just trying to understand what you said. So the attention-based mechanism works somewhat probabilistically, like if one of the amino acids or one of the sequence is present in one of the alignments, then it's going to keep a record of which of the other sequences are present, and then it's going to do the same for all the aligned all the aligned proteins, and then it's also going to figure out how frequently it occurs together, or like what is it probabilistic, is it frequency based?
That is a super great question. And so the question is, let's see if we can get this to go back. Ah. And so as we're going through one of these attention steps, how are we actually, getting the attention? And so is this just doing it based off of the frequency of what's going on inside this data, or is it doing it probabilistically? And the answer is that it's doing something sort of like a kernel machine. And if you aren't familiar with kernel machines, that's not a very good answer. But essentially what we're doing is each one of these asks every single other amino acid, every single amino acid asks every other amino acid, hey, I'm a E and you are a G. Do you think you have anything to tell me? And depending on the strength of that answer, depending on how confident an amino acid is that, yes, I do have something to tell you, then the amino acid will listen to that amino acid more. And so there's this communication thing where each one of these amino acids is really saying three things. One is, hey, I'm looking for stuff that can tell me about this. And also, I know a lot about this. And also, if you're interested about this, then you probably want to be a bit more like this. And this is where all the meat of transformers and attention is. So this is where the complexity starts to go up. But that's sort of the sky level overview of what's happening. Yes, Travis brings up a very important point. All of those statements are being trained by the data. So the transformer is learning how to do this as it goes.
Thanks. So this is, I think, kind of related to what Travis just said. So every amino acid is talking to every other amino acid, whether it's in the vicinity or far away. And every amino acid is telling that amino acid something. Where does this amino acid get the information to communicate to every other amino acid? And what does it communicate? And how does it learn that to communicate? And you're saying every amino acid is also learning something from the data. So you could elaborate on that part.
Yes, that is also a really great question. Inside each one of these amino acids is two parts. One is the part that says, hey, I'm an E, and so I have these sorts of physiochemical properties, and I have these sorts of evolutionary relationships. The other part is a positional encoding, which says, I am at this position. Both of these pieces of information are trained with our transformer, and it goes through the network, and the network says, okay, so here we have this positional information and this physiochemical information. I think that this physiochemical positional information wants to learn more about this physiochemical positional information. And what the transformation is doing there is sort of a hard thing to visualize, and is beyond what I could do in a little bit, but I can definitely talk more offline about it. Oh, I had something I was going to mention, but it's left me. Let's see. Yeah, I think it's gone. Okay, are there any more questions?
So we've used AlphaFold Multimer a little bit in our lab, and it seems like the same sort of, the same sort of idea works Is that how the multimer works also? Do you know? And is there any limitation to this kind of method to looking at protein-protein interaction?
Ooh, both of those are really great questions. In the early days, the way they would try to do like multimer type stuff is they would actually connect the domains by a long chain, or the different proteins by a long chain, and they'd have AlphaFold predict it. And I think AlphaFold multimer is doing something very similar, but without the long chain. And so I've heard mixed things about how well it does. It probably does better than most things, so I don't have a super firm answer there. And then your second question, can you remind me on your second question? Limitations for protein-protein interactions. There are, and so the primary signal that AlphaFold gets to play around with is the evolutionary signal. If there is strong evolutionary signal for binding partners for a protein, it actually seems like AlphaFold recognizes that. So in cases where you have protein structures that primarily are bound to some sort of ligand, AlphaFold will predict a protein structure in the bound conformation. And of course, it doesn't know anything about what's binding at the pocket, but it seems like, you know, it's using evolutionary signal to understand that, yes, there is something, you know, this is where something binds. And to that extent, with protein-protein interactions, if there's really strong evolutionary signal, it seems like you can recover some of that. But oftentimes, there's less strong evolutionary signal. And as soon as you start to talk about protein-protein interactions and all the different ways they can interact, it starts to become really complicated and not super well represented by AlphaFold. You know, it seems like you need more algorithmic intelligence to be able to solve some of those sorts of problems. And I just remembered the point that I forgot. Each one of these amino acids pays attention to every other amino acid, and each sequence pays attention to every other sequence. And what this means is that things scale poorly. And what I mean by that is as the sequence grows longer, the amount of things we have to pay attention to grows quadratically. And as we have more sequences in our multi-sequence alignment, the number of things we have to pay attention to grows quadratically. And so there is a question in a mid-session about the maximum protein length for AlphaFold. I think if you have enough RAM, if you have enough memory, you can probably do just about any protein size with enough AlphaFold tweaking. But it ends up taking a really long time at some point. I think they have like a period or a length 2,000 protein in the paper that they fold. And I think it took them like 24 hours on Google's machines. So, you know, it starts to scale poorly around there. Okay. I think that is it. If there are any more questions, you can, of course, find me around. Thanks a bunch.